Hello, this is Valerie Moore from the Frederian Gazette. Thank you for joining us this warm Wednesday evening as we reenact the controversial book, Say I Sue Them Not, written by Kingsley, edited by Alexander Phillips, and narrated by Pepper Holloway. If you've enjoyed our program so far and want to support three lesbians in a recording booth, please donate to our Ko-Fi at www.kofi.com/The Frederian Gazette. Content warnings for this episode include police brutality and violence, gunfights, death, references to torture, and caring for wounds caused by police violence. This program has been sponsored by Faizula's Medical Dictionary. With this book, you can be your own doctor. Diagnose conditions and remedies on your own time. We now pass the mic to Pepper Holloway, who will be reading Prosecution submits evidence of Kingsley's administration mistreating prisoners of war, including feeding POWs to the demon death squads. January 23rd, 1828. Loudon Station, Jenkinsville, Hiva. The Hevians' ability to block out reality has always fascinated and infuriated me. I could hold the bloody body of my best friend underneath their nose, and all they would see was a disrespectful, quote-unquote, icky who didn't know their place. I could almost understand it if they only ignored the horrors inflicted upon my people, but they are similarly indifferent to the sufferings of their own. In fact, they even went so far as to create institutions meant to punish their own citizens, but away from the public eye. Whenever a Hevian protested, it was always about the visibility of the horror, not the horror itself. The horror was always an Ichatel matter. After burning the tents of hundreds of homeless Ichatel, the Hevians arrested 3 of our friends, Devin, Ernest, and Sean, and implemented a strict patrol of the Ichatel district. They forced us into hiding and Marcus to return to Tobraga before he was arrested and/or Griffin closed the border. Despite the danger, Margaret remained with us, determined to rescue her husband, even if she had to go through God to do it. Given the active police presence, our most recognizable members, such as Siegfried, Asia, and Sandy, had to lay low, while Gary and I did all we could to track down our friends. We would never have found them if not for Amy's help, even though it nearly cost her head. Poor Amy made the mistake of approaching us during one of our planning meetings, and Margaret, who didn't know her, answered the door first and nearly shot her in the face. Thankfully, I was able to intercede before blood was spilt, and Amy told us about the information she had gathered while working at the Topper line. At the moment, our friends were held in Lancaster prison, and were making a nuisance of themselves by organizing riots. While our ultimate goal was to break our friends out of prison, Amy convinced us it was just as important to organize protests outside the prison holding our friends. She argued that it would bolster our friends' spirits, provide the people one more avenue to protest against the cruel Hevian Empire, and rattle prison guards and wardens who never had to deal with an angry populace before. Siegfried gave the plan his blessing, and Amy and I dedicated ourselves to tracking down the family members of prisoners locked up in the same prison as our friends. By the time we organized our first protest, our friends had already been transferred to a different prison, but that didn't deter Amy at all. She continued to show up at the protests and speak to the group of first 100, and then 200, and then 500 Ichatel, Indariums, Minotaurs, and a handful of Hevians. She denounced the Hevians for their racist and cruel policing policies, for the horrible treatment of their prisoners, and for the systematic way they punished us for poverty, sickness, and lack of education. Everything we couldn't control. Everything the Hevians forced upon us. When we learned of our friend's new location, Amy moved to that prison, but ensured that a large crowd still appeared in front of Lancaster prison, so those prisoners would know they hadn't been forgotten. We did this every time our friends were transferred, and that happened quite often. And soon large protesting crowds stood outside 10 prisons all over Hiva, calling for the liberation of our loved ones. We only paused our efforts once, and that was because Margaret's water broke, and we needed to rush her to the nearest bathtub, find Heron, and not crowd her as she gave birth, all without attracting the police's attention. While Amy and I organized protests outside of prison, Ernest, Sean, and Devin led several protests inside of prison, forcing the Hevians to beat them and constantly move them around. Margaret, Siegfried, and Asia took charge of the rescue attempts, and we even reached out to Devin's family in Ferdinand to petition for his release, creating tense relations between the two states. Eventually, Quinton caught wind of the nightmare our friends were enduring and our mass prison protests and published an article in the Daily Times. Others picked up the story, and it made headlines in international papers 3 months after our friends' arrests. As the protests grew, we raised funds, gathered weapons, and used Sandy's connections and Amy's intelligence gathering to locate our friends. Every time we discovered an address, the Heavians moved them, frustrating weeks to months of planning. We all got along well enough with Margaret. She improved all of our aim, Asia blaming her father's bad eye for why she always screwed right, while I helped improve her and Gary's reading, writing, and speaking skills. And Margaret's drab fashion sense brightened the longer she was around Asia. Our hard work paid off when one of Sandy's contacts confirmed our friends were safe in Frank's prison. Unfortunately, her prison was Lowe's Penitentiary, home to Hiva's quote-unquote most dangerous criminals, who lived based on the whim of an indifferent judge. An already almost impossible task grew even more urgent when we learned our friends were scheduled to be executed on January 25th, but not at Lowe's. Frank claimed she bribed the warden to send our friends to a small jail about 30 miles from Lowe's. To get to the smaller prison, our friends would have to board a train at Jenkinsville, a small town of 150 people about 20 miles outside of Bearcassa. I adjusted the oversized fedora as I remained hidden behind the tiled column. Asia on my right, shining a Heavian shoe, and occasionally glancing at Margaret, who was pretending to be a blind beggar woman. The train station was tight, and there were no private conversations, just loud children and indiscernible gossip. The teeny station was little more than an afterthought, 4 walls thrown together before the train arrived. The frosty winter air seeped in through the large round windows. Devin, Sean, and Ernest, along with their Heavian escort, were scheduled to arrive within the next few minutes. Then we would have a 2 to 3 minute window before their death train pulled up to the platform. At the moment, the police presence was minimum, but Frank reported that they would send at least 20 officers to escort our friend, and there were only 3 of us. Siegfried, Gary, and Heron remained in Bearcassa in case the worst happened and to care for Margaret's son, and Sandy was driving our escape cart. I felt for the revolver underneath my arm. 6 bullets, that was it, before I had to reload, if I got the chance. Margaret said fire fast and run. Sounded so easy when she explained the plan. The station doors opened and 20 police officers marched in, forming a tight circle around our muzzled friends and a large, menacing Itkatel I assumed was Frank. She was short, but built like a brick. A broken chain was carved into her neck scales, and a jagged scar ran down her cranium. She discreetly held up an Itkatel I couldn't recognize as Devin. His right eye swollen shut and the size of a coconut, his emaciated body suggested purposeful starvation, and his bloody blue uniform a testament to the beatings he endured. He swayed like one unconscious, and I feared permanent damage to his mind. Ernest was similarly beaten and worn, a hint of a bone flirting through Zier's ragged trousers as Zier limped forward. Sean, who was gaunt before his arrest, didn't seem to have a physical form. He was merely a wire frame of an Itkatel, ready to collapse into a heap of bones at any moment. He held his mangled and manacled hands close to his collapsing chest. I was already on my feet when Margaret threw her disguise aside and first fired, killing 2 Heavians. Asia and I flanked the gathering, screams and gunshots dancing around us, travelers ducking behind columns and benches. I shot the Heavian in the head before rushing forward and grabbing Devin, pulling him to safety. We were now behind a wall that partitioned the rest of the station from the outhouses. No escape that way. I helped a trembling Devin take off his muzzle, and he croaked with a faint grin. Kings? How long had it been since they gave him water? What took you so long? A rage I hadn't felt since I was 15 coursed through my body at his exhaustion, at the bruises that covered every inch of his body, and at the dry, dark blood that stained his blue prison uniform. My poor friend. He leant against the wall, barely conscious, barely alive, and for what? I leapt from behind the wall, firing wildly at the fleeing Heavians, determined to kill every last fucking one. The occasional bursts of blood confirmed my bullets found their targets until my revolver clicked uselessly. Jumping back and using one shoulder to hold up Devin, I fumbled with my ammunition, spilling powder in my desperate attempt to reload, my all-consuming, burning wrath making hand-eye coordination impossible. My ears pounding. Of all the fucking Itkatel, Dev, one of our best, nearly killed by Heavians who weren't fit to lick his boots? 4 bullets, fuck it. I joined the others. Frank choked a police officer with her handcuffs. Ernest wrestled a rifle from a bloody Hevian as Sean kicked his face in, and Asia and Margaret killed the rest. I shot at a groaning Hevian to satisfy my all-consuming wrath before returning to Devin, gently waking him, surprise blossoming across his face as if seeing me for the first time. Leaning all his weight against me, we rejoined the others. Asia wrapped her entire body around Ernest, nearly knocking Zir over, and nuzzled Zir's snout as Margaret unchained Sean's wrist before tossing the keys to Frank. "I got him," Frank told me after I uncuffed Devin. The massive Itatel scooped Devin up with surprising tenderness. A loud horn and the station rumbled. "The train!" "Let's move!" ordered Margaret. I led the way, my heart in my throat, as I had no idea what was waiting for us through those doors. Another horn and the chugging sound of the locomotive. How long until the station master contacted the local police station and they sent backup? We held a tight formation as we ran towards the front doors, the Hevians too astonished to stop us. Ernest and I burst through first, foolishly brandishing our weapons like swashbuckling heroes of Ferdarian pirate tales. Sandy sat nonchalantly in his cart, a large straw sun hat and gray cloak deemed sufficient enough to quote-unquote disguise him. His smoking revolver rested in his lap, a dead officer sprawled out next to the carriage, the rest of the Hevian bystanders pretending to ignore us. Ernest and Sean opened the cart doors, and Frank threw Devin into the hay before climbing in herself. I climbed in next, and Sean asked a one-word question about his new child before following. Finally, Ernest and Asia joined us. Margaret closed and locked the door and joined Sandy up front. As Asia and Ernest claimed a corner to themselves, and Frank and Sean burrowed themselves into the hay, I climbed towards the back and found Devin scrunched up against the wall. "Dev?" I whispered, lying next to him, half-heartedly throwing straw in us. "Hey, Kings," he whispered, his eyes closed. Did you miss me?" I slipped my hand into my suit jacket and pulled out his favorite blue cap. "Missed you enough to bring you this." Devin opened one eye and faintly grinned before gingerly taking the hat from me. "My lucky hat." "We'll take you to Heron as soon as we can," I said, Devin wincing as he placed the hat on his head. "I promise." "I'm fine. Just a little sore. Better than Sean or Ernest." They shattered Sean's hands and Ernest's right kneecap. "I'll be surprised if they can walk right ever again." "I'm sorry, Dev." "Can't say we didn't deserve it," said Devin proudly. "We created quite a ruckus." I shifted so I could comfortably lie next to him and watch his shallow breathing. It would be hours before we reached our hideout, maybe even days before Herring could look at him. Enlisting the help of an unvetted local doctor was too risky. "So I heard." "Oh, you didn't hear the half of it," he whispered with the flicker of a proud smile. "We made those bastards' lives a living nightmare." A flash of sorrow as his ears fell. "Too many died, though. Oh, far too many. It's not your fault, Dev. You can't control the Hevians." "No," he sighed forlornly, "but you can buy them." He glanced at Frank and winced as he scooted closer. "Frank bought almost every cop in her prison. Probably why we're still alive. That and she likes me." I raised my eye ridges. "Everyone can say what they want. I think she expects me to run off with her into the attic." "Why the attic?" "Apparently, that's where you go when you're one of Hiva's most wanted criminals and just broke out of jail." He shrugged and regretted it. "That's supposing I make it," he muttered, shifting closer and closing his eyes. "You're gonna be fine," I told him. "We're heading to a safe house now, and we'll find someone to treat your wounds." "Sounds wonderful," he muttered, already half asleep. "Wake me when we get there, huh?" "If I can," I said, only partially joking. "Cool," said Devin, attempting to slap my shoulder, but only pawing at it. You've just heard Prosecution submits evidence of Kingsley's administration mistreating prisoners of war, including feeding POWs to the Demon Death Squads, from Say I Slew Them Not, by Kingsley Montevello. Tonight's episode was read by Pepper Holloway and was sponsored by Faizula's Medical Dictionary. Be your own doctor today. Be sure to follow us on Instagram.
Join us next time for Hiva will not celebrate
and go
the
to our
46th
website
anniversary of Siegfried's Day.
www.thevegetariangazette.com
Cobrader will celebrate
for
as
episode
planned.
extras.